I promise you interesting session, so here it is. The last speaker before the break is our second guest from the US, Professor Carol Parish. She's from the Department of Chemistry in the University of Richmond, now a Fulbright Senior Scholar Fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as well. So, please.
Good evening. I'd like to thank Hagit for the kind invitation and Neil for having a passion for this important topic. Let's see if I can advance this. So I've been in Israel since August, almost 4 months, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my time in this lovely country, both professionally and personally. I'm grateful to the Fulbright Foundation and the U.S. Israel Education Foundation for making this visit possible. Professionally, I had a wonderfully supportive host, Professor Sassoon Sheikh at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He was smart and warm and welcoming. He runs a wonderful lab filled with people from all over the country, including a senior scientist, Dr. David Danovich, whose kind guidance was instrumental in helping me to learn the technique that I came here to learn. So not only did I accomplish my goal, but we've generated a reasonable set of very good data which should be publishable. So I'm very, very happy with my time here. Today I'm going to talk about women in science, and like the previous speaker, I'm going to emphasize, where I can, the importance of mentorship. The mentorship that I received and the mentorship that I strive to give to my students. Professor Sheikh and Dr. Danovich epitomize this approach. Mentorship is critically important, not just for encouraging women, but to encourage men and women to pursue careers in science and to reverse the alarming trend of diminishing numbers in this important work sector. Personally, I tried to explore every inch of Israel, from the Golan Heights in the north to Eilat in the south. During my time here, I've ridden my bicycle on the deserted streets of Jerusalem in Shabbat. I've developed a keen appreciation for Israeli wine. I've learned to make shakshuka. I've learned to say this when the cars are rushing me on the streets. And I've fallen in love with the desert. So it's been a very wonderful trip, and I'm very happy to be here today to talk with you about my experiences as a woman in science. So Professor Messer Yaron asked us to speak about our research in general terms and also our experiences as women engaged in the practice of science. And where possible, I'm going to try to highlight where I think my experiences might be somewhat different from my average male colleague. It doesn't mean that some of my male colleagues haven't had the very same experiences. But I think the average experience of a female is somewhat different than the average experience of a male, certainly in the United States, and my sense from having been here 4 months, I think that's true in Israel as well. So some roles that I'm comfortable with, is there a laser pointer? So at the top, I'm listing, how do I see myself as a scientist? What is the schema? Do you all know this word, schema? In the US, women in science, this word schema is very important. When I stand in front of a classroom on the first day of classes, the majority of the students, both men and women, expect a male professor. Because in their head, when they see the word professor, they see a man. And thank you. And so how do I see myself? What is my own schema for myself? So first, I think of myself as a chemist. Then I see myself as a physical chemist. There are very few women in physical chemistry, although I will say I don't know that that has been in the forefront of my mind. I'm aware of the influence it's had, certainly on me and definitely on my students. But secondly, I see myself in this subfield of physical chemistry, computational and theoretical chemistry, where there are even fewer women scientists. Then I see myself as a teacher. I spend a considerable amount of time teaching my students. I don't see myself as a gatekeeper. I think on average, that's where my experience as a female scientist, faculty member, is different on average than some of my male colleagues, who see themselves as teaching what we call in the States weed out courses. Courses that are intended to take a large group of people and narrow them down to a much smaller group. I don't like that approach to science. I think that's one of the problems with the diminishing interest in science, is we have to find a way to teach everyone and to encourage everyone to pursue science. Certainly we know that geopolitical climates are clearly dependent upon having a skilled science and technology workforce. I've highlighted in red mentor, because I do think that that's where, on average, sometimes women scientists have different experiences than male. Some roles I'm less comfortable with is that of being a role model. When I stand in front of my classroom, and over time, when they start to realize that actually it's perfectly reasonable to see a female professor as it is to see a male professor, I also realize that I can't make mistakes, I have to be entertaining, I have to be passionate. I realize I'm a role model for both young men and young women about what a scientist looks like. The second role that I'm somewhat uncomfortable with, although I recognize the importance of embracing it from time to time, is that of a dissident, particularly when it comes to old-fashioned ideas from an earlier time when science was dominated by men. So what do I enjoy most about my professional life? Certainly the challenge of solving difficult technical problems. That drives me. It's for those of you who golf. I know there's a big golf course down in Caesarea, right? I equate it to golfing, right? So in golf, you're constantly chasing a little ball all around the field trying to get it into a little cup. It's incredibly frustrating. But when you succeed, it will motivate the next 1,000 strokes. My science is very much like that. On a daily basis, I'm frustrated with what I don't understand and with the progress that I'm making to solve a problem. But when I find that kernel of enlightenment, it drives the next few months. I also like doing work that I think has some larger impact. My work is very, very fundamental in nature, but I think one of the things I'm good at is finding a way to connect up the fundamental with the bigger picture. And I think that's one thing that young people, both men and women, need to do in order to be able to write proposals, to obtain funding, to support their scientific ideas. I also like mentoring young people. I mentioned that a moment ago. What do I enjoy the least? I hate grading. Grading is like homework, but you're now a faculty member instead of being a student. I hate anything that begins with A. I hate administration. I hate assessment. I think assessment is a dirty word. And accounting. The bureaucracy involved with being a faculty member, I don't enjoy, although I recognize it's a necessary task. I also dislike departmental politics. But it's key to succeeding in academic and likely in industrial careers. So let me tell you a little bit about the university that I'm at, the University of Richmond. It's a private institution with significant resources for teaching and research. It has a $1.8 billion institutional endowment. There are 2,400 undergraduates, about 400 graduate students. There are no graduate students in the sciences. There are a handful of postdoctoral fellows, but the bulk of my research is accomplished with undergraduate students. So you can see where teaching and mentorship is incredibly important. My results are dependent upon my ability to communicate with my students and to mentor them in the achievement of excellence in science. There's a very strong culture of research at my institution, and there's significant support for the sciences. We have big laboratories, a significant amount of internal funding, and in the last 10 years, we've about doubled the size of the science faculty. And there has been an institutional priority to hire women as well as other underrepresented groups, which in the United States specifically refers to African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans. So let me tell you a little bit about the chemistry department in which I spend most of my time working. There are 15 tenure stream faculty. 5 of those faculty are women. 4 of them were hired in the last 4 years. So again, there was this big growth with a keen focus on diversifying the faculty. There are 4 PhD support faculty, people who help the tenure stream faculty to do their job. One of those is a woman, and there are 5 support staff. 75% of our faculty have external funding. 100% of the women have external funding. We graduate between 45 and 70 students a year, which is a very high percentage considering the small size of the school, only 2,400 students in total. About 60% of those are women, and I do agree with the previous speaker that one of the reasons why we have a high percentage of women in chemistry at the University of Richmond is we have 5 very strong women working in the department. And a significant number of our students go on to graduate school and on to medical school. My research group, there's about 15 students in my group. I have 2 postdocs, I have a post-baccalaureate fellow, and everybody else are undergraduates. In the last 10 or 15 years, between 60 and 65% of my students have been women. I don't necessarily encourage women any more than I encourage men, but women do seem to populate my lab to a slightly higher degree than some of my colleagues. Oops, wrong way. So what does it mean to be a theoretical and computational chemist? What do I do on a daily basis? So this is a quote that no one really knows the origin of. That is, to understand something means to derive it from the most fundamental level, from quantum mechanics, but no one really understands quantum mechanics. So my work is highly interdisciplinary. I use the tools from math and physics implemented on a computer to solve problems in biology and chemistry. Now you understand why I'm able to raise funding, right? I can make connections to just about anything. So how do you use computers to do chemistry? Again, schema. We go back to schema. Most people think of a chemist in a white coat mixing colorful liquids that steam out the top, right? I don't do anything like that. I don't generally like to get my hands dirty. I use a computer to solve problems in chemistry and physics and biology. So how do we do this? I'm trying to understand the structure of molecules. So here's a picture of a molecule. But this molecule can take on different shapes. I would describe this one as the extended shape, right? These 2 double lines with the oxygens are far apart, but I can also rotate about this bond and I can bring the other oxygen down. These are 2 shapes of the molecule. They correspond to different structures, but also different energies. We can represent the structures and energies of a molecule using what we call an n-dimensional map. We live in a 3-dimensional world, and so for those of you who do hiking, you're used to seeing topographical maps, which show regions of high area and regions of low energy. Regions of high altitude and regions of low altitude. So if I only have 2 degrees of freedom in my molecule, I can generate a topographical map showing the regions where the molecule is at very low energy and where it's at very high energy. So if you then expand that, well, if I have a molecule with 100 degrees of freedom, 100 movable parts, I have 101 dimensional surface. We can't visualize that. I have a hard time visualizing 4 dimensions, but we can take slices through it. And so we generate these potential energy, they're called potential energy surfaces, to try to understand the shapes of molecules, how they move, we call that the dynamics, and if we understand how the nuclei and the electrons move, then we can predict what the molecule will do in the future. And of course, that helps us to be able to control the chemistry that's taking place, the chemistry and the physics. So how do we construct the potential energy surface? I use molecular mechanics, which is a very, very simple approach where we approximate the atoms as balls and the bonds between them, the electrons as springs. It's amazing it works as well as it does, but it's very useful when applied to larger molecular systems like protein and DNA. My group also does quantum mechanics. So quantum mechanics is using the probability of where the electrons exist in the field of the atomic nuclei. Once we have these multi-dimensional surfaces, we sample them. We, again, use tools from computer science and mathematics to move along the surface, to find the minima, to find the maxima. The maxima tell us something about the bottleneck for reactivity. The minima tell us something about how the molecules behave at room temperature. So what are the types of projects we study? So my research is diverse by design. The unifying theme is the methodological approach that we take. So we look at the conformational analysis of small molecules and drug-like ligands, all the way to molecular dynamics of proteins, protein folding. So in the last few years, we've published a number of papers using these tools of quantum mechanics and molecular mechanics. We've looked at how a new kind of bonding called halogen bonding affects the interactions between two base pairs in DNA. Most people don't realize it, but there are quite a few halogens present in the human body, and they're believed to to be incorporated into base pairs, and if so, they lead to stable base pairs. They can be expanded upon to include a new genetic alphabet. We've also done work looking at biosensors, as well as protein folding, as well as how oxygen species, like the air, will damage DNA and lead to point mutations for which proteins have a difficult time fixing. We also have funding from the Department of Energy to look at the reactivity of molecules in oil shale. Part of my work here at the Hebrew University was learning a new method called valence bond theory to understand the behavior of oil shale, and we've published a couple of papers recently on that project. Actually, all three of these are on the oil shale project. And as well, we've looked at conformational analysis of marine natural toxins, all the way to looking at high quantum calculations on diradical species. So some recently completed projects that we're working on right now, and again, I do all this with undergraduates. We're looking at, we're continuing work on protein folding. We've recently submitted a paper looking at this molecule, which likely has applications in high density materials, potentially explosives. We've looked at molecular wire candidates, and again, more oil shale reactivity. Some of the projects that my students are currently working on now, hopefully on a daily basis, 10 hours a day, while I'm in Jerusalem exploring, or in Israel exploring the desert, is protein folding, homology modeling of some neuroreceptors. We're also designing new drugs for the HIV protease, which is part of the HIV/AIDS life cycle. And while I was working at Hebrew University with Sassoon and David, we completed a valence bond characterization of these benzynes. So let me tell you a little bit, just as I wrap up, how I got to this point. So I feel like I've been very successful, and I attribute my success to two things: hard work, incredibly hard work, and a lot of luck. A lot of serendipitous being at the right place at the right time, talking to people, being confident. Where did my confidence come from? So I, too, was born in 1962 in the US, at a small city in the north of New York State, quite near the Canadian border. I sort of ally a little bit more with the Canadians than I do with the people in the States. I came from a working class family. My parents were second generation US. Both of their parents had emigrated. I went to primary and secondary schools run through a Catholic organization, a relatively good instruction in the non-sciences, but pretty mediocre instruction in math and sciences. When I graduated, I was always expected to excel. My family, my parents, I have 3 older brothers and sisters, my parents always pushed this work ethic and aptitude and application of that aptitude to success. My mother also told me that I should take a typing class, but she also told me there was nothing I couldn't do. But she always wanted me to have a backup plan. I took 4 years off and I worked. I think that's where my work ethic came from. It's probably similar to some of your Israeli students who serve in the army for a few years before going to university. I then did a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD in chemistry. I had an okay undergrad mentor. I had a pretty poor PhD mentor. He didn't do well with men or women. He didn't do well with people generally. But then I went on to I got married to a chemist in I always have to look this up, 1993. And then I went on and I did a postdoc with Clark Still at Columbia University, and he was an amazing mentor. He was smart, he was insightful, and he was very supportive. Then started, oh, that's a little bit out of order. So after the postdoc at Columbia, then I took a job at a small college in upstate New York, Hobart and William Smith colleges, where I was, so I was a senior lecturer or an assistant professor. I was tenured, promoted to associate professor. Then I did a sabbatical with a second wonderful mentor, Roald Hoffman. The year after that, I relocated to the University of Richmond because of the resource to support sciences. So what was the U.S. reality that I grew up in, right? So it wasn't until 1920 that U.S. women had the right to vote. Before World War II, women generally didn't work, but because they needed a workforce during the war, you know, Rosie the Riveter, women went out and worked. But of course, after the war ended, most of the women either went into low-paying jobs or they went back to working at home. My mother grew up in this time. In the 60s and 70s, there was this period called the second feminism, where the first feminism was when women went out, the suffrage, when women got the vote. So one of the more influential people in the U.S. with respect to women's rights was JFK, President Kennedy, because he established this, let me get it right, this Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. About the same time, Betty Friedan published an important book called The Feminine Mystique, which said if we continue to keep women out of the workforce, our society is poorer for it. And at about this time, also, the National Organization of Women was founded in the U.S. So I came up, you know, most of my schooling was in the 70s. This was a very, very exciting time for men and women who were progressive and who kept up with media and the literature. And my parents, even though they didn't go to college, were definitely of that ilk. So in my experience, there was no segregation in my education, even though I did go to a religious school. My older brothers and sisters, one went to a boys' school, my two sisters went to a girls' school. By the time I came around, they were together. Girls were encouraged to excel. I never felt like there was anyone, man or woman, who I couldn't outcompete. I was raised in a relatively competitive environment, or I was encouraged to be competitive. But at the same time, as I was sort of living in this bubble, thinking that I could do anything I wanted to, there was and still continues to be a disproportionate distribution of women in the workforce. In most homes, even when I was a kid, my mother did work part-time, but in most homes, women's scope, and even today, women's scope of responsibility includes all of the menial tasks, taking care of the home. And for those women who work, they do that on top of things. It's not to say that always happens in all homes, but I think still in the US that is the average. Also, when I enrolled in my first college introductory chemistry course, my instructor said, again, talking about gatekeepers and running a course that wants to weed out anyone who has any interest in science, he said, today's the first day of class. I want you to look to your left and look to your right. And 50% of you will not successfully finish this course, and all of those will be women. So I dropped that course that day and signed up with someone else. But you could imagine there are some women and men who would have internalized that, who would have left science, who would have had a greater problem than I did with that. So I should wrap it up at this point, but I would like to say that I do believe, and hopefully we'll touch on this in the next in the panel discussion, I don't think, well, I'd like to hope, I like to be optimistic too, although I don't think I'm as optimistic as you are. I don't think today that the majority of people want to be biased. But I think many people, men and women, continue to this day to have inherent biases and schemas about what they're looking for when they look for excellence. And I hope we discuss some of that in the next section.